May 5, 1945, Okinawa, Japan. The Battle of Hacksaw Ridge. A young American medic stands alone on a cliff edge as dawn breaks. Behind him, 75 wounded soldiers lie scattered across the battlefield, some already dead, others dying. In front of him, the Japanese army controls everything beyond this ridge. His own unit has retreated, ordered to withdraw after suffering catastrophic casualties. Desmond Doss has no weapon. He's never carried one. His fellow soldiers mocked him for it, called him coward, beat him, tried to get him court-martialed. His own officers wanted him gone, believing a conscientious objector had no place in combat infantry. But now, with the dawn light exposing his position to enemy fire, Desmond makes a simple prayer he'll repeat 75 times over the next 12 hours. Please, Lord, help me get one more. And then he goes back into hell. By the time night falls, Desmond Doss will have single-handedly lowered 75 wounded men down a 75-foot cliff using a rope sling and a double bowline knot he learned as a Boy Scout. He'll do it while under constant enemy fire, refusing to carry a weapon, stopping only to pray between each rescue. 3 weeks later, President Truman will place the Medal of Honor around his neck, the first conscientious objector to receive America's highest military award. This is the story of how a Seventh-day Adventist from Virginia who refused to kill became one of the most decorated soldiers of World War II. It's about faith tested by fire, courage without violence, and what happens when absolute conviction meets absolute chaos. This is Desmond Doss's war. Desmond Thomas Doss was born February 7, 1919 in Lynchburg, Virginia, into a family shaped by violence and redemption. His father, Thomas Doss, was a World War I veteran who came home traumatized, what we'd now recognize as severe PTSD, but in 1919 was just called being troubled. Thomas drank heavily. The alcohol didn't erase what he'd seen in the trenches, but it numbed it temporarily. The Doss household was tense, walking on eggshells, never quite sure when Thomas's war would resurface in their living room. The incident that would define Desmond's entire life happened when he was young. Accounts vary on his exact age, but he was somewhere between 7 and 10 years old. His father and uncle got into a violent argument, both drunk, both veterans carrying their own demons. The fight escalated until Thomas pulled a gun. Desmond's mother, Bertha, threw herself between them. She grabbed the gun and handed it to young Desmond with urgent instructions. Run to the police, give them this weapon. Keep these men from killing each other. Desmond ran through Lynchburg streets carrying his father's pistol, a child literally preventing fratricide, understanding at a visceral level that violence destroyed families. The image of his father, the man who should protect them, ready to kill his own brother, burned into Desmond's consciousness. The Doss family were Seventh-day Adventists, a Protestant denomination that observes Saturday Sabbath and emphasizes biblical literalism. On their living room wall hung a framed picture common in Adventist homes, an artistic rendering of the 10 Commandments. Young Desmond would stare at the 6th commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," illustrated with an image of Cain killing Abel. After the incident with his father's gun, that commandment took on absolute meaning. Desmond made a covenant with God and himself. He would never take a human life. Not in anger, not in self-defense, not in war. Never. This wasn't passive pacifism born from fear or philosophical abstraction. Desmond had seen violence up close, understood its consequences, and chosen to reject it completely. But his rejection of killing didn't mean rejection of service. The Adventist faith emphasized helping others, healing rather than harming. Desmond absorbed these values deeply. When Pearl Harbor was attacked in December 1941, Desmond was 22, working in a shipyard, a job that qualified for draft deferment as essential war work. He could have sat out the war safely, morally justified, legally protected. He enlisted anyway. Desmond walked into the recruitment office in April 1942 and stated his position clearly. He would serve in the medical corps, he would not carry a weapon, and he would not work on Saturdays, his Sabbath. The recruiter looked at this skinny kid from Virginia like he'd lost his mind. The military in 1942 had provisions for conscientious objectors, but they were complicated. True COs, those who objected to any military service, could be assigned to alternative service, forestry camps, mental hospitals, other non-combatant work. But Desmond wasn't a complete CO. He wanted to serve in combat just without killing. The classification for this was 1AO, conscientious objector willing to serve in non-combatant military roles. The Army accepted his application but clearly had no idea what to do with him. Desmond was assigned to the 77th Infantry Division and sent to basic training at Fort Jackson, South Carolina. From day one, he was an anomaly that the military system didn't know how to process. Basic training is designed to break down individual identity and rebuild soldiers as a unified fighting unit. Weapons training is central to this transformation. Desmond refused to touch a rifle. While other recruits learned to field strip, clean, and fire their M1 Garands, Desmond stood aside. His fellow soldiers didn't understand. To them, refusing to carry a weapon in infantry combat was suicidal and endangered everyone. If Desmond wouldn't shoot, someone else would have to cover his position. His pacifism looked like cowardice wearing a religious excuse. The mockery started immediately. Coward! Jesus freak! Conscientious objector! Spat as an insult. Desmond endured it quietly, trying to explain his position when anyone would listen, which was rare. Then came the violence. Several soldiers decided to beat the pacifism out of him. They caught him alone. Multiple attackers, fists and boots, trying to make him fight back or quit. Desmond took the beating without defending himself or reporting his attackers. Returning violence for violence would violate everything he believed. His company commander, Captain Glover, saw Desmond as a problem to be eliminated. Glover tried everything to force him out: extra duties, harassment, psychological pressure. When those failed, Glover attempted administrative removal, filing paperwork to have Desmond discharged as unfit for service. The paperwork went up the chain, and Desmond faced a decision point. He could accept discharge, leave the Army, return to safe shipyard work. His family urged him to take it. His fiancée, Dorothy Shuda, begged him to come home. Staying meant continued abuse, possible court-martial, uncertain future. Desmond refused discharge. He'd made a commitment to serve, and despite the Army's treatment, he would fulfill it. His Sabbath observance created additional conflict. Seventh-day Adventists observe Saturday as holy, refraining from work. Desmond requested Saturday passes to attend church services. The military operates 7 days a week, especially in combat training. Granting religious exemptions for one soldier seemed to undermine unit cohesion. Officers denied his requests repeatedly. Desmond went absent without leave to attend church, technically a court-martial offense. The situation escalated. At one point, Desmond faced the real possibility of court-martial for refusing orders and leaving base without permission. His father, Thomas, despite their complicated relationship, intervened. Thomas contacted a former Army acquaintance who now worked at the War Department. The intervention worked. Desmond's Sabbath observance was officially recognized and court-martial proceedings were dropped. But the social situation didn't improve. Desmond remained an outcast in his unit. Men who would soon face combat together refused to trust the one soldier who wouldn't carry a gun. The 77th Infantry Division completed training and received orders for the Pacific Theater. They would be fighting Japan across a series of increasingly bloody island campaigns. The violence Desmond would witness would test his convictions in ways he couldn't imagine. Before shipping out, Captain Glover made one final attempt to remove him. He called Desmond into his office for a direct conversation. Not harassment or orders, but an honest assessment. Doss, you're going to get killed out there. Or worse, your refusal to fight will get other men killed. I'm giving you one last chance to accept discharge. No shame, no punishment. Just go home. Desmond's response was characteristically simple. With respect, sir, I'm going where the unit goes. When men are wounded, they'll need a medic. That's what I'll be. Glover looked at this stubborn, idealistic kid who'd endured months of abuse without breaking, and recognized something he hadn't seen before. Desmond wasn't refusing to serve. He was refusing to kill. Those were different things. All right, Doss. But when this goes bad, and it will go bad, don't say I didn't warn you. Desmond shipped out to the Pacific with the 77th Infantry Division. His fellow soldiers still didn't trust him, still mocked him, still believed he'd break under fire. They were about to be proven spectacularly wrong. The 77th Infantry Division's first combat operation was the liberation of Guam in July 1944. For most of the soldiers, including Desmond, this was their first exposure to actual warfare. Not training exercises with blank ammunition, but real bullets, real explosions, real death. The invasion of Guam was violent and chaotic. Japanese forces had fortified the island extensively, and they fought with the fanatical determination that would characterize the entire Pacific campaign. Banzai charges, mass suicide attacks were terrifying to face. Enemy soldiers running directly at you, screaming, accepting certain death to inflict maximum casualties. Desmond went ashore with his unit as their medic, carrying his medical kit but no weapon. The first time he heard incoming fire, the distinctive crack of bullets passing near his head, his body's instinct was to drop flat and find cover. But wounded men were already calling for help. He learned immediately that being a combat medic without a weapon meant a different kind of courage. When everyone else could shoot back, could feel like they were doing something active against the threat, Desmond could only expose himself to treat casualties. Each time he ran to a wounded soldier, he was completely vulnerable. His first casualty was a soldier hit in the chest, bleeding heavily, calling for his mother in the confused way that mortally wounded men often do. Desmond's medical training took over. Assess the wound, apply pressure, administer morphine, move to the next casualty. There would be time for emotional processing later. Right now, men needed help. The soldiers who'd mocked him in training watched Desmond work under fire, and their attitudes began shifting. He wasn't cowering or hiding. He was running toward danger, repeatedly to drag wounded men to safety or treat them where they lay. The religious objector they dismissed as a coward was demonstrating a different kind of valor. Over the brutal weeks of the Guam campaign, Desmond treated dozens of casualties. He learned the grim realities of battlefield medicine, that sometimes the best you could do was comfort dying men, that morphine was mercy when wounds were unsurvivable, that you worked until exhaustion and then kept working. He also learned practical skills that would save lives later: how to move quickly across open ground without drawing fire, how to find wounded men in dense jungle terrain, how to improvise when medical supplies ran low, how to triage when multiple casualties needed help simultaneously. The 77th Division successfully liberated Guam, then moved to the Philippines for the Battle of Leyte in October 1944. This campaign was larger and more complex than Guam, involving coordinated amphibious landings and inland advances through difficult terrain. At Leyte, Desmond's reputation solidified. During one engagement, his unit was pinned down by Japanese machine gun fire. Several men were hit and lay exposed between American and Japanese positions. Retrieving them meant crossing open ground under direct fire. Desmond didn't hesitate. He ran out, reached the first wounded soldier, and began dragging him back. Bullets kicked up dirt around them. He made it back, then went for the next man. And the next? He made multiple trips across that killing zone, each time expecting to be hit, each time protected by what he interpreted as divine providence and what others might attribute to incredible luck. One soldier he rescued was pinned under enemy fire for hours, certain he'd die there. When Desmond appeared and dragged him to safety, the soldier broke down sobbing, not from his wounds, but from gratitude and disbelief. The ridicule stopped. Completely after Leyte, Desmond was no longer the coward who won't fight. He was our medic, the guy who'd come for you no matter how bad the situation. Soldiers who'd beaten him in training now wanted him nearby during combat. His presence became psychologically reassuring. If you got hit, Doss would get to you. Captain Glover, who'd tried to remove Desmond from the unit, admitted he'd been wrong. "I didn't understand what you were doing, Doss. I thought you were afraid to fight. I was wrong. What you're doing takes more courage than what the rest of us do." Desmond's response was typical. "I'm just doing my job, sir. Every man here is doing his part." But there was a cost Desmond didn't discuss with others. Watching men die, unable to save them despite your best efforts, accumulated psychologically. Carrying wounded soldiers whose injuries were horrific. Hearing dying men's last words to pass to families back home. Working until physically exhausted, then finding more wounded who needed help. Desmond dealt with this through his faith. Each night, when possible, he'd find a quiet moment to pray, thanking God for protection, asking for strength to continue, praying for the wounded and the dead. His Bible, carried in his medical kit, was his constant companion. Other soldiers might find comfort in letters from home or camaraderie with buddies. Desmond found it in scripture. The 77th Division rotated off the line after Leyte for rest and replenishment. They'd taken significant casualties and the survivors were exhausted. Desmond used the time to repair his medical equipment, write letters home to Dorothy, they'd married just before he shipped overseas, and prepare mentally for what everyone knew was coming. The final push toward Japan itself would require taking Okinawa, the last island before the Japanese home islands. Intelligence indicated it would be the bloodiest campaign yet. The Japanese would defend it with everything they had, knowing that losing Okinawa meant losing the war. The 77th Infantry Division received orders to prepare for the invasion. Desmond, now a corporal and respected veteran medic, understood that Okinawa would test him in ways Guam and Leyte hadn't. He was right, though he couldn't imagine how severely. The 77th Infantry Division landed on Okinawa on April 1, 1945, Easter Sunday, ironically. The initial landing was surprisingly unopposed. Japanese forces had decided not to contest the beaches, instead fortifying the island's interior and preparing to make the Americans pay in blood for every yard of ground. Okinawa's terrain favored defense: rough coral rock, caves, ridges, and cliffs that provided natural fortifications. The Japanese had months to prepare positions, dig tunnels, pre-position supplies, and create interlocking fields of fire. They planned to bleed the American invasion force until the casualty count became politically unbearable. For the first weeks, the 77th Division advanced through relatively light resistance, but everyone knew this was temporary. The real fighting waited ahead. On April 26, the 77th received orders to take Maida Escarpment, a 400-foot high ridge that dominated the surrounding terrain. Americans called it Hacksaw Ridge because the coral cliff face was steep and jagged like a saw blade. Taking it was essential for continuing the advance, but the Japanese understood this too. They'd fortified the ridge heavily. The escarpment was essentially a natural wall. The cliff face was nearly vertical in places, 75 to 100 feet of sheer coral rock. The top was a plateau pockmarked with caves, bunkers, and hidden positions. Japanese artillery had pre-registered the approaches, meaning they could drop shells precisely on any attacking force. The only way up was cargo nets, the kind used on ships, that engineers would throw over the cliff face. Soldiers would climb while exposed to fire from above. Once on top, they'd face entrenched Japanese positions with limited cover. It was a defender's dream, an attacker's nightmare. The assault began April 29th. Multiple companies attacked simultaneously, clambering up the nets under withering fire. Desmond climbed with his unit, medical bag slung across his back, hands gripping rope, bullets ricocheting off the coral around him. Men were hit on the nets and fell. Some died from the fall itself. Others hung wounded, screaming for help, unable to climb further or descend. Desmond tried to help where he could, but the priority was reaching the top where the heaviest casualties would be. The Americans gained the top of the ridge through sheer bloody determination. Soldiers reached the plateau, established a tenuous foothold, and began pushing Japanese forces back. But the enemy didn't retreat far. They fell back to prepared positions and counterattacked repeatedly. The fighting on top of Hacksaw Ridge was close quarters and brutal. Rifle range often measured in yards. Grenades rolling into foxholes, flamethrowers clearing caves, soldiers shooting enemies they could see clearly, could recognize as individual human beings rather than distant targets. Desmond moved through this chaos, treating casualties under constant fire. The intensity was beyond anything he'd experienced. At Guam and Leyte, combat had moments of intensity interrupted by relative calm. On Hacksaw Ridge, the fighting was continuous, desperate, exhausting. His medical training and experience paid off. He'd learned to assess injuries quickly, who needed immediate treatment, who could wait, who was beyond help. He'd learned to work while under fire, to keep his hands steady while explosions went off nearby, to compartmentalize emotionally until the job was done. But the scale of casualties was overwhelming. Combat medics normally handled dozens of wounded in a day-long engagement. On Hacksaw Ridge, dozens became wounded every hour. Desmond worked continuously, treating men as fast as he could move between them, using his supplies until they ran out, improvising with whatever was available. The American position on the ridge was precarious. They held ground but couldn't advance significantly. Japanese counterattacks came in waves, often at night, with fanatical determination. Each attack created more casualties. Desmond treated wounded from both sides, American soldiers and Japanese prisoners, making no distinction in medical care. His unit's officers noticed something remarkable. Desmond's presence affected morale significantly. Soldiers fought more aggressively, knowing their medic would reach them if they were hit. The psychological impact of hearing medic and knowing Doss would come was substantial. On May 4th, after nearly a week of continuous fighting, the Japanese launched a massive counterattack. They'd been infiltrating tunnels under American positions, concentrating forces, preparing for one overwhelming push to drive the Americans off the ridge entirely. The attack came at night, hundreds of Japanese soldiers emerging from caves and tunnels, screaming, firing, throwing grenades. The American position nearly collapsed. In the chaos and darkness, units became scattered. Communication broke down. Casualties mounted catastrophically. Desmond worked through the night, moving between wounded men, often unable to see more than a few feet in the darkness. He identified casualties by their screams, by touch, by instinct. He administered morphine, applied tourniquets, dragged men to relatively safer positions. By dawn, the American position had held, but barely. The ridgetop was covered with casualties, dead and wounded from both sides mixed together in the torn coral landscape. Every man who could still fight was exhausted, ammunition was running low, and everyone knew the Japanese would attack again. What happened next would become legend. Dawn broke on May 5, 1945, revealing the carnage from the night's fighting. The top of Hacksaw Ridge looked like a slaughterhouse. Bodies everywhere, wounded men calling for help, the ground slick with blood. Japanese forces controlled most of the plateau. American forces held only a small section near the cliff edge. The situation was unsustainable. The company commander assessed their position. Massive casualties, low ammunition, exhausted troops, and enemy forces prepared to overrun their position with the next attack. He made the tactical decision every ground commander dreads: withdraw. The order went out: fall back, descend the cliff, regroup at the base of the escarpment. The men who could still walk began moving toward the nets hanging over the cliff edge. The wounded who could be carried were being helped by comrades, but dozens of men were too badly wounded to move on their own and too numerous to carry. The standard military practice in an emergency withdrawal is brutal but practical. Evacuate who you can, leave who you can't, return for them later if possible. On Hacksaw Ridge, later meant those men would almost certainly be killed by Japanese forces or die from their wounds. Desmond understood this calculation. He also understood he couldn't leave them. As his unit descended the cliff face, Desmond stayed on top, alone, surrounded by wounded American soldiers and advancing Japanese forces. Without a weapon, armed only with his faith, his medical training, and a length of rope, he began with the man closest to the cliff edge. The soldier was badly wounded, unable to walk, semi-conscious. Desmond fashioned a rope sling using a litter and the double bowline knot he'd learned as a Boy Scout, secure enough to hold a man's weight, designed not to tighten under load. He secured the wounded soldier in the sling, braced himself at the cliff edge, and began lowering him. 75 feet straight down, hand over hand, rope burning his palms, arms shaking with strain. When the soldier reached the bottom, men grabbed him and Desmond pulled the rope back up. Then he went to find the next man. Please, Lord, help me get one more. Japanese forces were moving through the area, consolidating control, looking for remaining American soldiers. Desmond worked in the open, completely exposed, visible to anyone watching. Bullets occasionally cracked past him.
He ignored them.
There was a wounded man who needed help. He dragged the second soldier to the cliff edge, 50 yards across broken ground, the wounded man semi-conscious and heavy, Desmond straining with every step. He rigged the sling again, lowered him down, pulled the rope back up. Please, Lord, help me get one more. The third man was bleeding from a stomach wound, the kind of injury that's excruciating and often fatal. Desmond gave him morphine, applied what bandages he could, apologized for what he was about to do, and dragged him to the cliff. The soldier screamed with pain as Desmond moved him. There was no gentle way to do this: lower him down, pull rope up, Find the next man. Please, Lord, help me get one more. Desmond entered a state that combat soldiers sometimes describe. Time distorts, physical pain fades, you become purely functional. He wasn't thinking about the impossibility of what he was doing, about the Japanese forces around him, about his exhaustion. He was thinking about the next wounded man and the mechanics of getting him to the cliff edge. Some of the wounded were conscious enough to understand what Desmond was doing. They begged him to leave them, to save himself. He'd waste too much time on them, get himself killed for nothing. Desmond refused. He'd come for every man he could reach. The rope sling system was crude but effective. Lower a man down, secure him at the bottom, pull rope back up. Find the next casualty. Repeat. The process took 5 to 10 minutes per man, depending on how far they were from the cliff edge and how badly they were wounded. The hours blurred together. Morning sun rose higher, heat intensified. Desmond's hands bled from rope burns, his uniform was soaked with blood and sweat. He treated wounds when necessary, administered morphine when he had it, dragged men who couldn't move themselves, always working toward that cliff edge. Some casualties were beyond his ability to move, too badly wounded, tangled in wreckage or positioned where Japanese fire made approach suicidal. Desmond had to make agonizing decisions about who he could save and who he couldn't. He stayed with the men he couldn't evacuate, talking to them, praying with them, making sure they didn't die alone. Japanese soldiers discovered him multiple times. In several documented instances, enemy soldiers saw Desmond treating wounded Americans, had clear shots and didn't fire. Whether they recognized him as a medic, the Red Cross on his helmet was visible, respected his humanitarian mission, or simply couldn't believe what they were seeing, Desmond was repeatedly spared when he should have been killed. In one incident, Desmond was treating a wounded soldier when a Japanese grenade landed near them. The explosion would kill both men. Desmond threw himself over the wounded soldier, shielding him with his own body. The grenade exploded, shrapnel tore into Desmond's legs and lower body, but the wounded soldier survived. Desmond treated his own wounds, wrapped them quickly, didn't have time for proper care, and continued working. Please, Lord, help me get one more. By mid-afternoon, he'd lowered dozens of men down the cliff. His arms trembled with exhaustion. The rope had frayed from repeated use. His medical supplies were completely exhausted. He was working on pure determination and prayer. American forces at the base of the cliff realized what was happening. Men would suddenly appear at the top of the cliff in a rope sling, lowered by hands they couldn't see. Word spread. Doss is still up there, he's bringing them down one at a time. Several soldiers wanted to climb back up to help him. Officers forbade it. Climbing into that position would just create more casualties. All they could do was receive the wounded as Desmond lowered them and pray he'd make it down alive. As sunset approached, Desmond found the last man he could reach, a soldier who'd been hit early in the fighting and had been lying exposed all day, certain he'd been forgotten. When Desmond appeared, the soldier thought he was hallucinating. Nobody would be crazy enough to still be up there. I'm here, buddy. Let's get you down. Desmond rigged him into the sling one final time, lowered him down with arms that barely functioned from exhaustion, and then faced a decision. The rope was frayed almost to breaking from repeated use. It might not hold his weight for descent, but staying meant certain death. Japanese forces would control the ridge completely by night. He rigged the rope, committed himself to God's protection, and descended. The rope held, barely. When his feet touched ground at the base of the escarpment, soldiers surrounded him. Some were men he'd saved. Others had heard what he'd done. Many were crying. The medic they'd mocked in training, the conscientious objector they'd doubted, had just accomplished something none of them could believe. Captain Vernon, who'd taken command after other officers became casualties, approached Desmond with something like awe. How many, Doss? How many did you bring down? Desmond genuinely didn't know. He hadn't been counting. As many as I could reach, sir. The company clerks tried to establish a number from the men who'd been lowered down, and their accounts of seeing Desmond work. The estimates varied. Some said 50, some said over 100. They settled on a conservative official count. 75 men. 75 soldiers who would have died on Hacksaw Ridge survived because one unarmed medic refused to leave them behind. Desmond's actions on May 5th transformed him instantly from respected medic to genuine legend within the 77th Division. But the battle for Okinawa wasn't over, and Desmond wouldn't stop serving because he'd already done the impossible. Over the next 2 weeks, he continued working as his unit fought to take and hold Hacksaw Ridge. His wounded legs, shrapnel wounds from the grenade he'd thrown himself on, hadn't healed properly. He should have been evacuated for medical treatment. He refused, claiming other men needed the medical resources more. On May 21st, a Japanese grenade landed near Desmond's position. Once again, he threw himself on it, not to absorb the blast this time, but to bat it away before it exploded. The grenade detonated in the air and shrapnel tore through his arm, shattering bone. This time, evacuation wasn't optional. His arm was badly damaged, and he needed surgical intervention to save it. Medics placed Desmond on a stretcher and began carrying him to the aid station. During the movement, they came under sniper fire. The medics had to take cover, temporarily leaving Desmond on the stretcher. While lying there, Desmond saw another soldier who'd been hit and needed help. Despite his shattered arm, he rolled off his stretcher, crawled to the wounded man, and began treating him. When the medics returned and found Desmond had given away his stretcher to another casualty, they didn't know whether to admire or curse his stubbornness. Finally evacuated off Okinawa, Desmond spent months recovering in military hospitals. The injuries were severe enough to end his combat service. The shrapnel in his legs would cause problems for the rest of his life. The shattered arm healed but never regained full function. While recovering, he received notification that he was being awarded the Medal of Honor. The citation detailed his actions on Hacksaw Ridge and his sustained heroism throughout the Okinawa campaign. On October 12, 1945, President Harry Truman placed the Medal of Honor around Desmond Doss's neck, the first conscientious objector to receive the award. Truman reportedly said to him, "I'm proud of you. You really deserve this. I consider this a greater honor than being president." Desmond's response was characteristically humble. "Thank you, Mr. President. I'm glad I was able to serve." Desmond Doss returned home to Virginia in 1946 as a hero, but also as a severely injured man dealing with physical and psychological trauma that would define the rest of his life. The immediate medical concerns were substantial. Shrapnel remained embedded throughout his body, 17 pieces in his legs alone, too deep or too close to vital structures to safely remove. These fragments caused chronic pain and occasional infections for decades. His shattered arm healed with limited mobility and constant discomfort. But physical injuries were only part of the story. Modern medicine would recognize that Desmond was suffering from severe post-traumatic stress disorder. In 1946, this was still called combat fatigue or shell shock and was poorly understood and inadequately treated. Desmond experienced vivid nightmares, reliving Hacksaw Ridge, seeing the faces of men he couldn't save, dreaming about wounded soldiers calling for help he couldn't provide. He'd wake in panic, disoriented, sometimes believing he was still on Okinawa. Dorothy, his wife, learned to recognize the signs and help him reorient to reality. Certain sounds triggered intense reactions. Fireworks, car backfiring, any sudden loud noise could send Desmond into a fear response. The 4th of July was particularly difficult. Celebrations that other veterans might enjoy became ordeals of anxiety for Desmond, the explosions too reminiscent of combat. Crowds were challenging. The hypervigilance necessary on the battlefield, constantly scanning for threats, monitoring everyone around you, didn't turn off in civilian life. Desmond found himself unable to relax in public spaces, always watching, always alert, exhausted by the constant tension. He struggled with what psychologists call survivor's guilt, the question that haunts combat veterans. Why did I survive when so many didn't? Desmond had saved 75 men on Hacksaw Ridge, but hundreds more had died in the Okinawa campaign. He'd pray for the ones he couldn't reach, the ones who died despite his efforts, wondering if he could have done more. His faith, which had sustained him through combat, now became both comfort and burden. He believed God had protected him for a purpose, had guided his hands in treating the wounded, had given him strength when human strength failed. But he also grappled with theological questions about suffering, why God allowed the horrors of war, why good men died in terrible ways, how to reconcile a loving God with what he'd witnessed. Desmond dealt with these struggles privately, rarely discussing them even with family. The cultural expectations for men, especially veterans in the 1940s and 50s, emphasized stoicism and self-reliance. You didn't talk about psychological problems. You got over it and moved on. But some wounds don't heal by ignoring them. In 1946, shortly after returning home, Desmond contracted tuberculosis, likely while in military hospitals, where the disease was common. The TB ravaged his already compromised health. Treatment in the 1940s involved collapsing the infected lung to allow it to rest and heal, a brutal procedure that left Desmond with significantly reduced lung capacity. The medical complications cascaded. An experimental antibiotic treatment for TB caused severe side effects, including permanent hearing loss. Later treatments caused adverse reactions that left him hypersensitive to medications. His body, already damaged by combat injuries, became increasingly fragile. Financial struggles added to the burden. Desmond and Dorothy lived on his military disability payments, which were modest. Medical bills accumulated from ongoing treatments. They couldn't afford many of the therapies that might have helped. Pride and self-sufficiency kept Desmond from seeking additional assistance he qualified for. He worked when his health allowed: carpentry, handyman jobs, anything he could manage with his limited physical capacity. The work was therapeutic in some ways, giving him purpose and routine. But chronic pain made consistent employment difficult. Dorothy became his primary support system, managing his medical appointments, helping during his worst days, maintaining stability when everything else was unstable. The stress took its toll on her as well, though she rarely complained. Caring for a severely disabled veteran with PTSD in an era before adequate support systems was exhausting physically and emotionally. Yet through all this suffering, Desmond maintained his core beliefs. He never expressed regret about his choice to serve or his refusal to carry a weapon. When asked if he'd do it differently, his answer was always the same: "I'd do exactly what I did. God gave me a mission and I fulfilled it." His faith deepened through suffering rather than weakening. He attended church regularly when health allowed, participated in his Adventist community, and spent hours reading scripture, where others might have become bitter or questioned God's goodness after such trials. Desmond saw his pain as a small price for saving 75 lives. In the late 1950s, Desmond's health declined further. The combination of combat injuries, TB complications, and treatment side effects left him increasingly disabled. By his 60s, he required a hearing aid, walked with difficulty due to leg pain, and had limited use of his injured arm. In 1976, Dorothy died from a car accident. Sudden, unexpected, devastating. Desmond lost his primary support system, his companion through decades of struggle, the person who'd understood his wounds better than anyone. He was 67 years old, in poor health, and suddenly alone. Friends worried he wouldn't survive her loss. Depression added to his physical ailments, but Desmond drew on the same inner strength that had sustained him on Hacksaw Ridge. He continued living, continued attending church, continued sharing his story when asked. He remarried in 1993 to Frances Dumont, finding companionship and care in his final years. But his health continued deteriorating. The shrapnel fragments in his body caused recurring infections. Old injuries flared with arthritis. Breathing difficulties from his collapsed lung worsened with age. For decades after the war, Desmond Doss remained relatively unknown outside military circles and his local community. He'd received the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest award, but had returned to quiet civilian life rather than pursuing publicity or fame. He spoke occasionally at churches and veterans events when invited, sharing his testimony of faith and service. But these were modest gatherings, local audiences, nothing that brought his story to national attention. Desmond preferred it this way. He'd never sought recognition and felt uncomfortable being called a hero. The Medal of Honor itself sat in a drawer at home, rather than being displayed prominently. When curious visitors asked to see it, Desmond would retrieve it matter-of-factly, show it, then put it away again. It wasn't false modesty. He genuinely believed he'd simply done his duty, and that duty didn't require a medal. His perspective on heroism was characteristically humble. The real heroes are the ones who didn't come home. I was just doing my job as a medic. They were the ones who faced the enemy, without the protection I had from not carrying a weapon. This logic was somewhat Twisted, Desmond had faced extraordinary danger precisely because he didn't carry a weapon, but it revealed his mindset. He saw his actions through the lens of duty and faith rather than heroism and courage. In 2004, a documentary titled The Conscientious Objector brought Desmond's story to wider attention. The film detailed his background, his struggles in the military, and his actions on Hacksaw Ridge. Veterans who'd served with him were interviewed, their accounts confirming and expanding on what Desmond had done. The documentary reached audiences who'd never heard of Desmond Doss. For many, the story seemed almost unbelievable, a conscientious objector who became a Medal of Honor recipient. A medic who saved 75 men in one day without carrying a weapon. It sounded like fiction, but every detail was documented. Combat reports, witness statements, Medal of Honor citation, medical records, all confirmed the basic facts. If anything, Desmond had understated his own actions over the years. The documentary sparked renewed interest in his story. Journalists requested interviews. Veterans organizations invited him to speak. Schools asked him to address students about service, faith, and courage. Desmond, now in his 80s and in very poor health, accepted what invitations he could. His message to audiences remained consistent. Faith matters, conviction matters, helping others matters. He emphasized that his story wasn't about his personal heroism, but about what becomes possible when you trust in something larger than yourself. When speaking to young people, he focused on the importance of staying true to your beliefs even when everyone around you disagrees. I was mocked, beaten, nearly court-martialed for my beliefs. But I knew what God called me to do, and I didn't let others' opinions change that. Whatever your convictions are, if they're truly important, don't compromise them because it's difficult. In 2006, Desmond was honored at a ceremony where a U.S. Army Reserve Center in Alabama was named after him. He attended in a wheelchair, frail but present, accepting the recognition with his characteristic humility. When asked how he felt about having a military facility named after him, he said, "I hope it reminds young soldiers that courage comes in different forms. You don't have to carry a gun to serve with honor." By 2006, Desmond's health had deteriorated to the point where he required constant medical care. The cumulative damage from combat injuries, tuberculosis, treatment complications, and simply aging had left his body failing in multiple ways. He developed kidney problems requiring dialysis. His breathing difficulties worsened, requiring supplemental oxygen. Mobility became impossible without assistance. He moved into a care facility where he could receive the medical attention he needed. Even in decline, Desmond maintained his faith and humor. Nurses and caregivers remember him as gracious, uncomplaining despite obvious pain, and deeply spiritual. He'd pray with staff members who requested it, would talk about his experiences when asked, and remained mentally sharp even as his body failed. In 2016, filmmaker Mel Gibson released Hacksaw Ridge, a major Hollywood film depicting Desmond's story. Andrew Garfield portrayed Desmond, and the film received critical acclaim, multiple Academy Award nominations, and significant box office success. The film brought Desmond's story to millions globally. Suddenly, audiences around the world knew about the conscientious objector from Virginia, who'd saved 75 men without firing a shot. The story resonated across cultures and generations. Here was a different kind of war hero, one defined by preserving life rather than taking it. Desmond watched an early screening of the film. At 97 years old, near the end of his life, he saw his story portrayed on screen, saw the ridge he'd climbed, saw actors depicting the worst day of his life and his greatest moment. When asked what he thought, he said simply, "I hope it shows people that faith matters, even in the worst circumstances." On March 23, 2006, Desmond Thomas Doss died at his home in Piedmont, Alabama. He was 87 years old. The cause was respiratory failure, his damaged lungs compromised decades earlier by combat injuries and tuberculosis, finally giving out. His funeral was held with military honors. Veterans attended from across the country, many who'd never met him but understood what he represented. The 77th Infantry Division Association sent a delegation. Current soldiers attended to honor a legacy that still inspired their service. He was buried in Chattanooga National Cemetery, a simple military headstone marking his grave. The inscription includes his rank, his unit, his dates of service, and the Medal of Honor designation. It doesn't mention the 75 men or Hacksaw Ridge. It doesn't need to. Those who know the story will never forget. Those who don't will discover it. Desmond Doss's story challenges conventional understanding of heroism, courage, and masculinity in ways that remain relevant decades after his death. Traditional military heroism emphasizes aggressive action, advancing under fire, destroying enemies, demonstrating dominance in combat. Heroes charge machine gun nests, lead assaults, kill enemies despite personal risk. This archetype permeates military culture and broader societal understanding of what courage looks like in war. Desmond represented an entirely different model. His courage was defensive, not offensive. He ran toward danger to save rather than destroy. He demonstrated strength through endurance and conviction rather than aggression. He was heroic precisely by refusing to kill. This inversion of normal military heroism initially made him incomprehensible to fellow soldiers and commanding officers. The military system is designed to create fighters, people willing to use violence efficiently to achieve objectives. Desmond wanted to serve but rejected violence completely. The system literally didn't have a category for him. The genius of his approach, though he'd never call it that, was separating service from killing. Most soldiers in World War II believed that serving meant fighting. Fighting meant killing enemies, and refusing to kill meant refusing to serve. Desmond proved this equation wrong. He served more courageously than most while never firing a shot. His impact on fellow soldiers reveals something profound about what actually matters in combat. Soldiers don't fight primarily for abstract causes or patriotic ideals. They fight for each other, for the men beside them, to not let down their unit. Desmond embodied this completely. His entire combat role was protecting his fellow soldiers. By saving wounded men repeatedly under impossible conditions, Desmond earned more genuine respect than he ever could have through killing enemies. Every man in his unit knew, "If I'm hit, Doss will come for me." That assurance was more valuable psychologically than having another rifle in the line. His story also challenges religious stereotypes. Conscientious objectors during World War II were often dismissed as cowards hiding behind religious exemptions. Desmond demonstrated that religious conviction and physical courage aren't opposites. They can be complementary. His faith wasn't an escape from danger, but the source of strength that allowed him to face it. The question of whether Desmond's approach could or should be replicated is complex. Not every soldier can be a medic. Combat requires people willing to use violence when necessary. A military composed entirely of conscientious objectors couldn't function. But Desmond's example suggests that modern militaries have room for diverse expressions of service and courage. Not everyone needs to fit the traditional warrior mold. Some of the most valuable contributions come from people who approach service differently. His influence on medical personnel in modern militaries is substantial. Combat medics today study his actions as examples of courage under fire, of prioritizing casualty care despite personal risk, of the psychological impact that dedicated medical personnel have on unit morale. More broadly, Desmond's story resonates with anyone navigating the tension between personal conviction and institutional pressure. Standing firm in your beliefs when everyone around you, people you respect, people with authority over you, people whose approval you want, demands you compromise, requires a specific kind of courage that transcends military context. His experience being mocked, beaten, and nearly court-martialed for his beliefs before ultimately being proven right speaks to the vindication that sometimes comes from stubborn adherence to principle. Not always. Many people maintain unpopular convictions and are never vindicated. But sometimes refusing to compromise leads to outcomes that justify the struggle. The 75 men Desmond saved on Hacksaw Ridge went on to live complete lives because of his actions. They married, had children, built careers, contributed to their communities. The ripple effects of those 75 saved lives, the children who were born, the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren, represent hundreds or thousands of people who exist because Desmond refused to leave wounded men behind. That's a legacy that can't be measured in conventional military metrics like enemies killed or territory captured. It's a legacy of life preserved, of families kept whole, of futures made possible. Desmond's story, while inspiring, also raises difficult questions about faith, war, and moral consistency that don't have easy answers. First, the question of privilege. Desmond's conscientious objection was possible partly because the military system, despite resistance, ultimately accommodated him. Other objectors weren't as fortunate. They were imprisoned, dishonorably discharged, or socially destroyed for their beliefs. What made Desmond different? Partly his willingness to serve in combat roles, but also factors beyond his control. Supportive family interventions, officers who eventually recognized his value, luck in not being court-martialed. This raises questions about who gets to be a conscientious objector successfully. The system permitted Desmond to serve according to his beliefs while maintaining military discipline. Would that same accommodation be extended to objectors today? To objectors from less mainstream religious traditions? To objectors whose beliefs weren't grounded in recognized faiths? Second, the theological question. Desmond believed God protected him on Hacksaw Ridge. He interpreted his survival through multiple situations where he should have been killed as divine intervention. But what about the soldiers who died despite their own faith? Were they less deserving of protection? Did God favor Desmond specifically? These questions aren't meant to diminish Desmond's faith or experiences. They're the questions that soldiers throughout history have grappled with. The problem of survival when equally deserving people die. Desmond's own struggles with survivor's guilt suggest he wrestled with these issues too, even if he maintained his faith in divine protection. Third, the question of effectiveness. Was Desmond's approach, refusing to carry weapons while serving in combat infantry, actually optimal? He saved 75 men on Hacksaw Ridge, which is extraordinary. But could an armed medic have saved more by being able to suppress enemy fire while treating casualties? Or would carrying a weapon have fundamentally changed what made Desmond effective? His complete focus on medical care, his psychological impact on fellow soldiers who knew he'd never shoot them accidentally, his identity as purely a healer? There's no definitive answer. What's clear is that Desmond's specific approach worked for him, generated respect and results, and couldn't easily be replicated by others trying to apply his method without his conviction. Fourth, the broader question about conscientious objection and just war. Desmond believed killing was wrong, but believed the Allied cause in World War II was just. He navigated this tension by supporting the war effort without personally killing. But is this morally coherent? If a war is truly just, if defeating Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan was necessary to prevent greater evil, does refusing to kill while supporting others who kill maintain moral purity or constitute moral convenience? Pacifist traditions have debated these questions for centuries. There's no consensus. Desmond's position was consistent with his understanding of biblical commandment and his faith tradition's teaching. Others with different theological frameworks might reach different conclusions. Finally, the question of glorification. Does telling Desmond's story as heroic inadvertently glorify war itself? The combat sequences in Hacksaw Ridge are graphic and horrifying, depicting war's brutality. But they're also cinematically exciting, viscerally engaging. Does the emotional impact of Desmond's heroism make war seem like a context where nobility and meaning can be found, potentially making military service more appealing? This tension exists in all war stories. We want to honor individual courage and sacrifice while not romanticizing the institution that creates contexts requiring such sacrifice. Desmond's story emphasizes saving life rather than taking it, which partially addresses this concern. But it still depicts war as a space where individuals can demonstrate extraordinary virtue, which isn't entirely false but isn't the full picture either. These uncomfortable questions don't invalidate Desmond's story or diminish what he accomplished. They're necessary context for understanding that even the most inspiring narratives exist within complex realities where simple lessons don't fully apply. Desmond Doss died in 2006, but his story's relevance has only grown in the years since, particularly after the 2016 film brought it to global attention. Modern combat medics and corpsmen study his actions as exemplary medical care under fire. Military medical training incorporates lessons from Hacksaw Ridge about triage under pressure, maintaining focus despite chaos, and the psychological importance of casualty confidence. Soldiers fight more effectively knowing medical help will reach them. His story resonates in discussions about religious accommodation in military service. As militaries become more diverse religiously, culturally, ideologically, Questions about how to balance individual beliefs with military necessity become more pressing. Desmond's experience suggests that accommodation is possible and can enhance rather than undermine effectiveness. Conscientious objector communities cite Desmond as proof that refusing violence doesn't mean refusing service or courage. He's become an icon for people navigating how to maintain pacifist beliefs, while still contributing meaningfully in contexts where violence exists. Broader culture has embraced him as representing an alternative model of masculinity and heroism, strength expressed through endurance and compassion rather than aggression and domination. In an era questioning traditional gender norms and what courage means, Desmond offers a historical example of someone who succeeded by rejecting conventional expectations. Veterans dealing with PTSD and moral injury find resonance in Desmond's story. He experienced combat without having killed anyone, yet still suffered psychological trauma from what he witnessed. His struggles normalize the idea that you don't have to be a warrior in the traditional sense to be affected by war, and that seeking help isn't weakness. His faith-centered approach speaks to religious audiences across denominations. While his specific theology was Seventh-day Adventist, the broader principle, maintaining conviction despite opposition, trusting in divine strength during impossible circumstances, translates across religious traditions. Perhaps most importantly, his story provides a template for standing firm in unpopular beliefs without becoming rigid or self-righteous. Desmond maintained his convictions absolutely, but didn't condemn others who made different choices. He understood that soldiers carrying weapons were doing what they believed was necessary. He simply knew that path wasn't his. That combination, absolute personal conviction paired with respect for others' different convictions, is rare and valuable. It allows principled stands without demonizing opposition, moral clarity without moral superiority. May 5, 1945. A young medic stands alone on Hacksaw Ridge, surrounded by wounded men, facing impossible odds, armed only with faith and rope. 75 times he prays, "Please, Lord, help me get one more." 75 times he lowers a wounded soldier down a 75-foot cliff. 75 families receive telegrams saying wounded instead of killed in action. Preventivo. Men go home to wives, parents, children because one conscientious objector refused to leave them behind. Desmond Doss's story isn't ultimately about war. It's about conviction maintained under pressure, about courage expressed through service rather than violence, about what becomes possible when faith meets action. He proved that heroism doesn't require weapons, that you can face danger without inflicting it, that the choice to preserve life can be as brave as the choice to take it. He demonstrated that standing firm in unpopular beliefs sometimes leads to vindication, though never without cost. The cost for Desmond was substantial: combat injuries, tuberculosis, chronic pain, PTSD, decades of struggle with health and trauma. He paid prices for his convictions that others never had to pay. He did it without complaint, without regret, believing that saving those 75 lives justified any personal suffering. Was he right? Could he have served differently, accomplished more, suffered less? We'll never know the counterfactuals. What we know is what he did. Volunteered when he could have stayed safe, endured mockery and violence, served through 2 brutal campaigns, saved 75 men in one impossible day, and lived with the consequences for 6 more decades without ever wishing he'd chosen differently. His story challenges us with uncomfortable questions. How firmly do we hold our own convictions? What would we sacrifice for beliefs we claim are important? When everyone around us insists we're wrong, how do we know if we're principled or simply stubborn? Desmond didn't have easy answers to these questions. He followed what he believed God called him to do and trusted the outcome to faith. That won't satisfy everyone. Some will see his story as validation of religious conviction. Others will see it as fortunate survival despite unnecessary risk. Both interpretations exist within the same facts. What remains undeniable is that on May 5, 1945, when every tactical consideration argued for retreat, when self-preservation screamed to descend that cliff and escape, when the reasonable choice was to save yourself and accept that you can't save everyone, Desmond Doss chose differently. He stayed, he prayed. He worked until 75 men were saved. That choice, repeated 75 times across 12 hours under enemy fire, defines heroism as completely as any combat action in history. The men he saved knew it. The military that initially rejected him recognized it by awarding the Medal of Honor. History confirms it through the ongoing relevance of his story, 8 decades later. Desmond Doss proved that sometimes the strongest warriors are those who refuse to fight, that courage comes in unexpected forms, and that one person with absolute conviction can accomplish what seems impossible. He was a conscientious objector who became a war hero, a pacifist who earned soldiers' deepest respect, a man who refused to carry a weapon and saved more lives than most men carrying weapons ever could. He entered hell armed only with faith, fear, and the determination to get one more, and 75 times. He succeeded. That's not just a war story. That's a story about what humans are capable of when they refuse to accept that something is impossible, simply because everyone says so. It's Desmond Doss's story. It's a medic's story. It's an American story. But most importantly, it's a story about the power of conviction, the reality of courage, and the truth that sometimes the most heroic thing you can do is save a life rather than take one. Please, Lord, help me get one more. 75 times, and every time, he did.